In the name of Allah, the merciful, the omnipotent. Good afternoon, everyone. At the beginning of this session, I would like to extend all appreciation to the Arab Center for the wonderful organization, namely Mr. Maharan Kabrava, for the wonderful organization at this critical point in the history of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I also extend all the appreciation to our speakers, Mr. Kozhanov, and our colleague, Esfandyar from London. Each will be dedicated 20 minutes. Thereafter, we will open the floor to questions or comments. I would like to present the speaker, Mr. Esfandyar. He is the founder of Bourse and Bazaar Foundation in UK. It is a think tank focused on economic development and economic diplomacy in the Middle East and Central Asia, with a particular focus on Iran. He has published peer-reviewed research on Iranian political economy, social history, and public health, as well as commentary on Iranian politics and economics from 2021 to 2022. He was a visiting fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He also a holder of BA in Political Science and Middle Eastern Studies from Columbia University. He will be completing an executive master's in public administration at the London School of Economics. The second speaker, Mr. Nikolay Kozhanov, is a research associate professor at the Gulf Studies Center of Qatar University. He is also a non-resident scholar at Program of Economics and Energy at the Middle East Institute, Washington, D.C. His research interests are focused on the geopolitics of Gulf, hydrocarbons, and Iran's economy. He holds PhD in economics from St. Petersburg State University. I give the floor to Mr. Esfandyar on the impact of sanctions of Iran. He will be joining us from remote online. Please. سأعطيك نحو 20 دقيقة لتقديم ما لديك من ورقة. Please تفضل. أشكرك على هذه المقدمة الرائعة وشكرا للمركز العربي. أعتذر أنني لم أتمكن من الحضور بصفة شخصية بسبب التزاماتي.
On the panel with Nikolay again. So hopefully you'll be able to see my screen in a moment. It would be great if someone could confirm that for me.
We are seeing
I'll
it.
assume that you can see this. But for the purposes of today's talk, I'm going to be discussing essentially a method for measuring the effects of sanctions on Iran. So this is a discussion that's a little bit more methodological in focus, but I think it's going to be important as we basically come to potentially an inflection point in Iran's economy. I know we're all waiting, hopefully, to see if the nuclear deal will be restored. But as part of that restoration, it's going to be a moment to take stock of what the impact of sanctions have been since the reimposition of Iran in May 2018 by the Trump administration. And that's something that we'll unpack in this presentation. So the presentation I'm going to give you is focused on an econometric method called the synthetic control method. And this is a method that's been used increasingly in the study of economics to look at all sorts of instances in which some event or some policy would have led to a different economic outcome. And the purpose of the synthetic control method is to create for us a counterfactual so that we can compare what happened in a country like Iran to what would have happened had a policy not been put in place. So for example, had sanctions not been imposed, whether in the pre-JCPOA period or in May 2018, for example. The presentation is going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the synthetic control method, and then I'm going to actually show you some examples of how we've been working on using this method to look at the impacts of sanctions on Iran. I've been working with Professor Mohammad Reza Fazanagan from Philipps University in Marburg. I owe him a debt of gratitude. I will say he is the one who has been leading the way and really using this method to look at these questions. But we've uncovered, I think, some interesting things that gave us a platform to look at these issues in more detail. So what is the synthetic control method? Well, the idea here is to construct a synthetic Iran, so an Iran that is a weighted average of a set of countries that are similar to Iran in certain ways, but with regards to their economic composition, maybe their institutional framework, maybe their geography. And by using this synthetic Iran, we are given a counterfactual so that we can compare what would have happened had an intervention not taken place. And so what we want to see in the synthetic control method is that the synthetic Iran and the real Iran show very similar economic performance before a certain event or policy is put into effect. And then after that time, we would anticipate that there would be a divergence. And the divergence between the synthetic and the real Iran would tell us something about the impact of sanctions. So I've included a couple quotes here that explain the method, but the second quote I would point to is by Susan Athey and Guido Imbens. Guido Imbens is a Nobel Prize winner in economics, and they're really describing how this has become really the most important innovation in the policy literature around the use of econometric analysis in the last 15 years. And it is something that if you look at the economic literature today, you will see it's being used in many, many different contexts, including for the study of sanctions impacts. So what do we have to do to make sure that this method is used correctly? I think these are sort of the basic considerations, and by running through them, you'll understand a little bit better about why we're using this method. The first thing to consider is whether we should be using the method at all. And the reality is that sometimes economists and political scientists will use complex sort of methods or models when they aren't really necessary. And as economist Javad Salehi Esfahani has argued, you don't necessarily need a synthetic control method to show that sanctions had an impact on Iran's economy. If you simply look at data for trade or for investment or for any other sort of economic outcome, and you look at the time period in which sanctions came into place, it's often plainly obvious that sanctions had a significant impact. But there are times when you want to be a little bit more precise, and that's where the method can be useful. The second consideration is the selection of donor countries. So as I said, what we're trying to do here is to construct a synthetic Iran by taking basically a pool of similar countries, and these are countries that are similar economically. So for example, they could be oil producers, and so in our case we used countries from OPEC. They could be countries that are institutionally similar in terms of the kind of governance or the kind of institutions that are responsible for economic management. And so in our case, we've drawn from countries from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And geographic location also matters, because it's possible that events in a certain region may have had an impact on economic performance. And so here we're also drawing from countries from the Middle East and North Africa. And from this donor pool, we're then able to basically construct the synthetic Iran that we will compare the real Iran to. Then there's the choice of treatment year. And this is where it can be quite tricky when it comes to sanctions, because sanctions are imposed over time, their intensity increases over time. And so it's hard to say the precise year in which, let's say, we would expect the divergence to occur. But in the case of Iran, particularly looking back to the pre-JCPOA sanctions, it's really significant in the data that the outcomes for Iran got worse after January 2012, which is the period in which Iran came under stricter financial sanctions and in which an oil embargo by the EU came into effect. And so really, when we look at the year at which the divergence we would expect to take place, we can say that the treatment year would be 2011, because anything after that year would show the effect of sanctions in a more significant way on the real Iran, and we would then compare it to the counterfactual Iran. Then briefly, there's a couple points around quality and completeness of data. You want to use data from the donor pool countries that is similar in its construction and its quality and its completeness. And so here we're relying a lot on data from, for example, the World Bank or the IMF. And then it's not simply data you need for the outcome variable you're interested in. So let's say you're interested in the effects of sanctions on economic growth. You don't only need the GDP data, you also need the predictor variables. So we need to gather data on things like the composition of the country's demography, on population, on trade and other factors that might influence the key outcome we're looking at, which is growth. So what do we broadly expect to see? This is a little bit on the sort of hypotheses that we might have if you're using this approach to study the effect of sanctions on Iran. The first thing, which I mentioned before, is that Iran and the synthetic Iran should have the same performance before the treatment year. That matching is what tells us that the synthetic control method is going to do a good job of predicting what would have happened in Iran if the treatment had not taken place, i.e. if sanctions had not been imposed. The other thing we might want to look at is the gap between the performance of the synthetic Iran and the real Iran. And the gap is especially important if we are interested in the effects of more recent sanctions. So in the case of the analysis that Professor Farzan Agan and I have been doing, we have been interested in the effects of the sanctions imposed after May 2018, when the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA. And so in order to capture that effect, we don't have enough data after 2018 to treat that as the treatment year. And there is also the issue that sanctions effects compound. So there are lingering effects from the 2012 sanctions that were exacerbated by the reimposition in 2018. And so instead of looking at purely the divergence between the synthetic Iran and the real Iran, what we can look at is the change in the gap between the performance of the two, of Iran and its counterfactual. And that tells us something about whether Iran's performance is getting worse or better after the sanctions were reimposed in May 2018. So here are I'm going to run through a few charts that show you examples of this in practice. So this is trends in GDP. So this is GDP in purchasing power parity in constant international 2017 dollars. And you'll see that the dotted black line is the treatment year of 2011. There's very good matching. Iran, which means that the model is sort of showing what would have happened in Iran prior to the treatment year quite well. And we see that after the 2011 period, there is this divergence. Iran's economic growth really slows under sanctions, and it starts to lag the kinds of countries to which it's being compared through the synthetic Iran that's been constructed here. But the thing I would highlight is that the second part of our sort of expectations is borne out. So if you look between the red lines, which is the period of JCPOA-related sanctions relief, the gap between the synthetic Iran and real Iran narrows because Iran's economy starts to grow at a faster rate as secondary sanctions are lifted and as EU sanctions on Iran are lifted. And that substantiates that basically the model is capturing the effect of what sanctions probably did to growth overall. You can see a similar trajectory in terms of GDP per capita. So this is also in purchasing power parity terms. And what's notable here is, again, that the matching is very good prior to 2011. Then you start to get the divergence in the outcome variable. But during the period of sanctions relief, Iranian households benefited from the economic uplift, and that the gap between the synthetic Iran and the real Iran narrowed. So there was a little bit of a catch-up taking effect. What's also notable is that if you look at the data that we have here, which runs through 2020, the gap also shrinks considerably in 2020 because the countries that are used to construct the synthetic Iran all experienced the COVID-19 pandemic. So their economic performance went down, and particularly with regards to household, let's say, spending. And in Iran's case, actually, household GDP per capita was relatively stable, probably because Iran had already absorbed a lot of the same kinds of economic shocks that were related to the pandemic. For example, disruptions to supply chains and output that we saw in many countries. And so this is an interesting example of how the synthetic Iran suggests that in 2020 it would have been a tough year for Iran economically regardless, given the pandemic. But given that Iran had already gone through 2 years of recession, maybe that impact was a bit muted in the case of the real situation. Trends in goods exports, here again, excellent matching before 2011, and then a divergence as Iran's exports fall. What's notable here is that in the period of sanctions relief, between the blue lines, there was basically convergence. Iran's export performance matches what it would have been had sanctions not been imposed in 2011, so in the counterfactual scenario. Now, the explanation for this is probably that the vast majority of Iran's exports are oil exports, and we know that when sanctions are lifted on Iran, the oil exports rebound quite quickly. That's one of the expectations we have if the nuclear deal is restored. And so, frankly, in terms of the overall value of merchandise exports, it's reasonable to expect that during periods of sanctions relief, the gap between Iran and its counterfactual would shrink, because really we're just trying to look at what would happen. We're just capturing what would happen if oil exports come back online. The impact for imports is quite different, and you can see here that, again, there's very good matching until 2011, which is shown by the dotted line, but then the gap stays relatively wide, even in the period in which Iran benefits from sanctions relief, shown by the two red lines. There isn't a significant reduction in the gap between Iran and its counterfactual. The explanation for this, I think, is that Iran's imports are a function basically of demand. How much does Iran's companies and households, how much are they consuming? How much of that needs to be imported from abroad? And at the end of the day, Iran's economy is smaller than it would have been had sanctions not been imposed in 2011. And so even if there is a small recovery in demand in the period in which Iran is benefiting from sanctions relief, that recovery is coming from a smaller base. And so overall, the value of imports, I should say, would be lower. So that can help explain why this gap is not shrinking. It's more of a demand side phenomenon here. The final chart that I'm going to show is inflation. And in some ways, I think this is the most important and interesting of the charts to show, because on one hand, it's actually surprising that the synthetic control method would allow us to analyze inflation in this way. Inflation is sort of a notoriously volatile variable, but we show that before 2011, there's a
sorry, Esfandyar, sorry, I'm just disturbing you. You have 5 minutes. You have 5 minutes. Okay.
Thank you. I'm coming to the end. But after 2011, Iran starts to experience significant rates of inflation. Inflation exceeds 30%. This is related to a number of effects, weakness in the Iranian rial. It's related to monetary interventions within Iran itself. It's also related to actually just the increased cost of goods coming into the Iranian market. Now, what's notable is that, and we know this empirically from obviously the experience of the Rouhani administration, it's possible to bring inflation down very quickly if the country starts to benefit from sanctions relief that would alleviate some of those monetary and sort of trade pressures. And we see during the period between the two blue lines, so the period of JCPOA sanctions relief, basically the real inflation we saw in Iran, which fell below 10%, was in line with what we would have expected Iran's sort of inflation to be in that period. Now, one thing I would point out is that inflation in oil-producing countries is very much related to things like the oil price and the impact on government budgets and the national currency that's related to that. So all of the countries that are contributing to sort of the donor pool here are probably countries that have generally higher rates of inflation. So the fact that Iran can bring inflation down below 10% makes sense. But after 2018, we see that, again, the inflation rate skyrockets. So the big question, I would say, as we evaluate and look forward, sort of ask ourselves about the Raisi administration's economic management, and perhaps Nikolay will comment on this, is will they be able to replicate the success of the Rouhani administration in converting sanctions relief related to the restoration of the JCPOA into bringing inflation down below 10% again. That's going to be a big test for them because the previous government was successful in doing this, and we can see in this kind of analysis that it is possible, and it's intuitive why it is possible, but it remains to be seen whether the same conditions will apply again. So to conclude, just sort of a few comments on what the synthetic control method can tell us about the impact of sanctions on Iran. The first thing is that obviously the impact of financial and energy sanctions had a significant impact on Iran's economic development, really, across the different performance indicators that I just shared. And that divergence is going to stick with the country for a long time. Iran's economy will be smaller than it otherwise would have been for years to come. But the other thing that the analysis shows us is that Iran's economy can bounce back from sanctions, and there is a little bit of a catch-up effect. Sometimes that effect is very fast, as in the case of inflation. Things can go back to what they would have been or a normal situation relatively quickly. In other cases, what we're really talking about is the gap between the real Iran and its counterfactual shrinking, which suggests that Iran is slowly clawing back some of the lost economic performance related to the sanctions. So what this means is that synthetic control method is really useful for understanding the magnitude of the cost borne by a sanctioned country. We often want to put a dollar figure and say, okay, sanctions cost Iran this much money, or sanctions cost Russia this much money in terms of the negative economic impact. But it's very difficult to say what exactly that absolute figure would be. What we can do with the synthetic control method is by comparing Iran or any sanctioned country to a counterfactual, we can sort of show the magnitude of the effect. And that's really the gap that's being shown. So, is Iran's economy 10, 20, 30% smaller than it otherwise would have been at a certain period of time after the imposition of sanctions? That becomes a way to express the cost. It's basically an opportunity cost of having been subjected to the intervention of the sanctions. And then finally, I would say that there are also limits to this method, and we should be cognizant of that. Generally speaking, sanctions, the synthetic control method is useful for looking at macroeconomic impacts. But there are also, of course, more discrete sanctions impacts. Sanctions are designed to target sectors and even individual companies. It is more difficult to basically get the data that would be necessary to look at sectoral or firm-level impacts using the synthetic control method, although I know that Professor Farzan Aghan is working in that direction. But generally speaking, I would say that synthetic control method is something that needs to be paired with other kinds of quantitative and qualitative analysis to give us a big picture. So to summarize, the purpose of this presentation was really to say there has been some interesting developments in terms of the economic analysis that's being done to understand the impact of sanctions. It's giving us a better view of what happened from 2012 to 2016. It's giving us a view of what has happened from 2018 until today. And I think as we evaluate the Raisi administration's economic performance, having this big picture analysis that the synthetic control method is enabling will be a useful sort of tool and will give us some analytical precision that we probably lacked about 10 years ago when first encountering some of these questions. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا. Thank you so much. شكرا جزيلا على هذا المحاضرة القيمة. وطبعا بالنسبة افتكر انها مهمة جدا انه نظرة لو لم تكن هنالك العقوبات كيف تكون الاقتصاد الإيراني نمواً.
You've talked about the synthetic control method to evaluate the sanctions that have been leveled on Iran. Mr. Kozhanov is the next speaker. His paper is entitled Between Development, Growth and Survival, Iran's Economic Priorities under President...
Let me drive you away from economics to boring political economy, which probably implies less modeling and figures, but we'll talk about the situation where economy and politics are overlapping, and I believe that the brilliant speech by Esfandyar will be partly aided, supported by the conclusions that I made during my study. Whenever I also need to thank Dr. Mihran Kamrava for bringing me here and for giving this opportunity to share my ideas, as well as the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Whenever I'm preparing to speak on Iran's economy, I'm always recalling one statement which is attributed to Imam Khomeini, that the Islamic Revolution was not about the price of watermelons. This citation is, of course, taken out of the context, and it needed certain explanations. But from my point of view, even when it is considered separately, it represents quite an interesting characteristics of Iranian leadership economic thinking. While trying ideologically reject the importance of economy, actually since the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran and until nowadays, one of the key questions connected to the survival of the political system was exactly what kind of economic approaches should be adopted, and why and how these economic approaches should be merged together with the existing ideological norms and dogmas. And what's more interesting that if we have a look at the last 20 years, roughly starting with the last years of Khatami presidents and until nowadays, we can find that two presidents, Ahmadinejad and Mr. Raisi, were probably less prepared for the reforms they want to launch. But they were exactly launching the reforms that to a certain extent allowed the Iranian economic system to survive. It's not that popular to recognize, but basically the reform of the subsidies introduced by Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and certain revisions made in the control of the Iranian economy allowed this economy to stand against probably one of the hardest periods of economic sanctions. And nowadays, we see that the Raisi government is definitely challenged with the question and with the necessity to make certain readjustments within the economic system. And it's also interesting to see that basically if we have a look at the statements made by Raisi and his supporters during the election campaign and initial steps that were done during probably the first month after the election, we suddenly find that basically these statements and the ideas suggested initially were quite a selection of hectic thoughts and ideas. For instance, sometimes during the presidential campaign, Raisi was even addressing to the ideas of the 1980s that for the Iranian economy to survive, it should be using the agricultural sector as the main driver of development. Something which is definitely alluding to the theory of the Iqtisad Tawhidi, the united economy, God bless the economy, suggested during the first years of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Not to say that the team assembled to manage the economy of Iran at the Raisi is controversial, possessing different views and ideas, and moreover possessing different experience in terms of managing of this economy. And as one of the examples, we can address to their constant discourse about the necessity how to regulate the interbank interest rate. Sometimes the offers that were done by the present office, they were going into direct clash with the ideas of the Ministry of Economic Development. And there were definitely certain coordination needed among the players. And yet, by the end of the first year, we could say that there are at least several priorities that are clearly set out. The first priority is the necessity to intensify the economic growth, which was set as an 8% of GDP a year. Second, to fight corruption. Third, to create, to disassemble the unity existing between the sanctions and the country's development trajectory. So just to make the situation around the JCPOA non-influential, non-important for the development of the country's economy, or better to say, to mitigate the effect that the failure of the JCPOA or the restoration of the JCPOA, but not in the complete form, could have on the Iranian economy. And finally, it is the plan of so-called economic surgery, grand economic surgery, that was offered in May by Raisi, that implies the cancellation of the multiple exchange rate system, and that also implies the substantial transformation of the subsidy system that exists in Iran. However, the key question from my part here and for my, of my interest, why actually these reforms are happening now and what is driving them? Are they only about the necessity to cut the subsidy burden lying on the shoulders of the Iranian government? Or these reforms are actually kind of introduction to a long chain of transformations that need to be done within the Iranian strategic thinking, within the Iranian development approaches, in order to create a new and more sustainable Iranian economy? And when answering to this question, we could offer at least 4 reasons for the reforms to be started now. First of all, Raisi is believed by some analysts to be a successor, potential successor for the current supreme leader of Iran. For him, it's important to show that he can manage the country. Not to say that his predecessors basically failed to ensure a substantial economic growth and development. And even if we are taking into account the period of the JCPOA existence between 2015 and 2018, we could definitely say that while macroeconomic parameters were really positive, they failed to transfer into the social development, in the improvement of the social situation inside of Iran, which was definitely seen by people on the ground, and that was negatively perceived by the Iranian society. So for Raisi and forces that are following him, it's quite important to show that they can deliver the promises on the improvement of the economic situation. Second, there is now an understanding which is coming obviously from the previous experience that sanctions, even they are lifted, they are not going to be a solution for the economic development. And there is a number of reasons for this, beginning with the fact that was mentioned many times here that there are no guarantees that the sanctions will be lifted completely, and ending up with the fact that the damage done by the sanctions to the Iranian economy for the last 10 years at least, or 15 years at least, is so big that there is no a company or a country that would risk to come to Iran with the investments being in danger to lose them if the sanctions are restored on the American side. Not to say that the current reality of sanctions are not always going together with the economic meaning, but they're also going together with the imaginary risks. And the country which was under the sanctions will never draw that much attention and that much will from the side of foreign investors that this country which is unsanctioned. Not to say that the economic environment in Iran itself, including the banking system, is not favorable for immediate return of foreigners. The third reason for necessity to act right now is that sanctions, basically they had 2 levels of effects on the Iranian economy. The first level is the immediate impact when the economy is stressed by the very fact of the sanctions imposed and necessity to restructure the economy to get adjusted to living under the sanctions and the new realities. But as it's shown by the Iranian experience and partly by the Russian experience as well, this period can be lived through using different methods that can allow to allay people's and business concerns, that allow to restructure the economy and its ties, But what's more important for the Iranian economy, that there is a second level of impact. It is when the negative impact of sanctions is accumulating within the economy, and when the ability of a country to develop the very production base is put under the question. And by 2022, we already see that this was happening. On the one hand, for instance, when we are talking about the LNG industry of Iran, we could say that Iran is now latecomer to this market game, and it's sanctions that should be blamed in the first turn. We could say that since 2017, there was no major investment from the foreign company in Iran's economy, which also means that there was a lack of access to the modern technologies and modern investments on the Iranian side. Not to say that the majority of the industries, and these figures are available on the Central Bank of Iran website, on the website of the Parliament Research Centers, are showing that there is a substantial contraction in the output by a number of industries where the resources that Iran could allocate for the development are substantially limited. And we could see that, for instance, the light industries, the very backbone of the private sector and the development of the private sector, they are contracting in Iran for more than 5 years in a row. That means that for Iran, it's substantially important to accumulate domestic resources, what is left, in order to boost the development of the country. But here where Iran is facing the main problem, the current development model which is adopted has its limits. On the one hand, the model of resistance economy that was suggested and that was developed during at least the last 10 years, it allowed Iran, as I mentioned, to survive the sanctions pressure. It allowed because there were quite a number of solutions, effective solutions, at least from the short to mid-term perspective, offered, including partial self-sufficiency, diversification with a special emphasis on those sectors that were not sanctions, increasing the role of taxation, boosting and strengthening the social contract when the government was buying the loyalty of low layers of population through the handouts that might seem for us quite minimal, but in practice they were still able to change the situation for households in Iran that were living beyond or below the poverty line. And the volume of such households is quite big for Iran. Depending on the assessments, figure varies between 30 and 60%. And of course, not the last role was also played by the active exploitation of those opportunities that were provided by the international trade and economic system and those solutions that were offered by Iran. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to step much of this. And what could we see? We could see definitely that there is years when the sanctions were introduced, like for instance 2010, 2012, 2015, and after that usually it took Iran 2 years, 3 years maximum to restore the major macroeconomic parameters and to ensure at least the stability or ensure a certain growth. It happened at least twice, between 2012 and 2015, and between 2018 and 2020-21. Of course, there are certain distortions in this picture related to COVID, related to the unexpectedly higher oil prices, but still the dynamics of the main macroeconomic parameters shows that the country can survive. But the social situation gives different picture. So on the one hand, we could see that in spite of all efforts, the Iranian government basically failed to hold off the growth of prices and the growth of inflation. And for me, one of the most interesting parameters, which is, again, all this data is based on the official Iranian statistics. If we take the household expenditures for the period between 2016 and 2020, the most recent data, we could see that the budget of Iranian household was decreasing, meaning that the purchasing power and basically the ability of Iranian household to ensure their well-being was substantially limited. this discrepancy between development on one, between the growth of the macroeconomic parameters on the one hand and socioeconomic development is explained by the very nature of the suggested development model. Iran, being under sanctions, is compelled to operate with the limited resources, choosing exactly those areas where it can invest. And of course, the priority on the one hand is given to those industries that can ensure the income for the Iranian economy. On the other hand, the second priority is given to the substantial social programs that exist in Iran. But the problem is that, like in all countries with the elements of rentier state model, the social contract is financed exactly to the limit which is minimally enough to ensure the survival of the government. So that means that of the political system. That means that being under the pressure, Iran indeed pays a lot of attention to ensuring certain survivability of the lower layers of the population. But the volume which is allocated are substantially lower than those needed to allow the active development of human capital and to ensure the growth of social parameters. Not to say that the system which are existing in Iran right now, of course it has its own fallouts and drawbacks in the form of gray economy, in the form of extreme presence of the state and involvement of the state in the Iranian economy, which suppresses the private initiative and turning, for instance, any privatization attempt in basically the redistribution of property at the hands of different groupings connected to the government or to the military establishment. Not to say that existing ideological limits creating a certain specific of the financial system functioning, of course they are limiting possibility for revival of economy. Not to say that the sanctions system, which is subsidy system which is existing in Iran is definitely under the current circumstances should be considered as a heavy burden for the economic development of the country. What was suggested by Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, what is suggested by Raisi right now, is literally fighting not with the reasons or struggling not with the reasons of the problem of the economic development, but better to say with the markers of these problems. So the restructuring of just the subsidy system is only one of the steps towards the overall improvement. As it's discussed by the economists and by the majority of the economists, and I fully support this, the Raisi government in the end will be compelled to make deeper reforms and to use the current restructuring of the subsidies as a first step. But however, on this way, they will need to, first of all, to overcome certain ideological limits, understanding that social contract that currently exists between the government and the poor layers of the population needed to be revised, and maybe in certain cases at the expense of greater but temporary instability. And on the other hand, it's important to understand that right now the country is locked basically in the triangle of development necessities, necessities of growth, and necessities of survival. And balancing between these three necessities is something which should be the key principle of the system. Right now, what we see, the priority is given, first of all, to survival, and periodically, when sanctions are lifted or not that close observed, to intensification of the macroeconomic growth. Whereas the greater emphasis should be given to the social development. And this is something that I guess the government will understand sooner or later, given especially the existing social instability in Iran. And we might see, although I don't have a crystal ball, greater reforms happening in the forthcoming years. As instead of conclusion, I probably was quite critical and maybe a little bit harsh in my statements here. But I would like to say that the main reason was not to offend anyone, especially my Iranian friend, but rather to understand how the situation is developing and what should be expected in the future from it. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much. Nikolay, you are exactly on time.
أشكرك على
That we are going to the model of we need to be very cautious about celebrating that the sanction will be lifted and everything will go back to normal. So thank you so much for that comments. We have exactly 23 minutes because we need to conclude it at 3 o'clock. So I am going to give a round of questions. Okay, Dr. Nadar here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamid. My question goes to Mr. Esfandyar.
Wait a minute. If not, if the microphone is not working, you can come here.
No, I think, okay, that's fine. Thank you so much, Dr. Hamid. My question goes to Dr. Esfandyar. And just want to know, he said actually he's building the synthetic Iran based on sample of countries. So what are those countries? And the second question actually, if I may divide the factors influence the gap between synthetic Iran and real Iran to 2 factors. One is the sanction, and the other factors are other factors. So my question, whether these other factors could, vary through time. So, do we have, the assurance that this gap between synthetic Iran and the real Iran is because of the sanctions or the variation of other factors through time? Thank you.
Thank you. My sincere thanks to both speakers. I learned a great deal. I have a question. There's a book coming out that argues that one of the reasons that underlie the survival of the Islamic Republic is that the economy provides various means of enrichment for a significant chunk of the people with political privileges through various kinds of rent-seeking behavior, through various kinds of corruption, and that there are significant economic interests that are tied to the survival of the Islamic Republic, which in the long term, of course, undermine economic performance, but prolong the state's survival. Would either of you comment on this argument and this kind of structural rent-seeking that is part and parcel of the political economy of the Islamic Republic? Thank you.
Thank you. My question is in regards to the synthetic control method mentioned by the first speaker, and it is, how can you ensure that the ideological pressures of the donor countries match those of the real Iran? How can you differentiate between the pragmatic nature of worldwide defense in relations to economics, society, and politics? And how can you reach the outcome of these donor countries matching, on an accurate basis, the real Iran?
Okay, let's take this set of questions. I bet you there are some questions online. Probably some people might be on the no. Okay, no question online. So let's take this. Allow our speakers to respond to those questions, and then we'll take another set of questions, if time allows. Okay, so we'll go with Esfandyar. You will take it over.
Sure, thank you. So excellent questions on the synthetic control method, and I'll answer the first and third questions together. So in terms of what countries were in the donor pool, the idea here is to choose from a set of countries that are similar to Iran in ways that would matter for the country's economic performance. So we drew from the donor pool that we used in our analysis was from basically three sets of countries. Countries in the Middle East and North Africa, mostly to deal with the idea of a geographic similarity. So, you're capturing anything that might have happened in the region that would have impacted economic performance. Countries from the OPEC producers, because ultimately what we want to compare Iran to is other countries in which oil exports or energy exports are an important part of the overall economic composition. And then getting a little bit at the third question as well, there's the question of policy or institutional factors that might determine whether a country is well run economically or poorly run economically. And so here we're drawing on countries that are part of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So basically other countries that are predominantly Muslim, where, let's say, the sort of institutions have been shaped by a legacy of kind of Islamic institutionalism. And that helps us capture some cultural factors and some sort of, let's say, political/ideological factors that may be important. But the other thing to sort of point out here is that we aren't simply using the model to make sure that we're doing good, basically creating a good synthetic. And this goes back to the idea that you shouldn't only look at the synthetic control method. So if you look at Iran's performance and compare it to other sort of middle income countries up until 2012, which is the year in which the major financial and energy sanctions were imposed, Iran was actually a pretty average economic performer. It was delivering economic growth pretty much every year from the end of the Iran-Iraq War all the way until 2012. There was no major recession in that period. And the rate of growth was in line with other countries that were at a similar stage of development. So what that tells us is that basically nothing that was inherent to Iran's sort of political decision-making or institutional makeup or economic composition was leading to a significantly different set of economic outcomes within the period before sanctions. And this makes sense because then when we construct the synthetic Iran, we are effectively controlling for all of these other factors that may have had an influence on the divergence after 2012. Because what we're saying is if we create an Iran from countries that did not experience sanctions, and we use a set of variables with weights, and we sort of create that counterfactual, what we can see is whether the imposition of sanctions on the real Iran in 2012 led to a divergence. And that's basically what we show in each of those charts that I shared in the presentation, is that controlling for these other factors by creating a counterfactual from countries that did not experience sanctions but are otherwise similar to Iran, there's really only one reasonable explanation for why Iran underperformed. Now, it is possible that Iran's underperformance or the negative outcomes might have been less severe after the imposition of sanctions if Iran had made better policy decisions. That's certainly possible. But this comes down to where what we're really trying to look at is the magnitude of the effect. It's not so much that we want to say precisely, the sanctions were responsible for $200 billion of lost GDP. It's hard to say that with precision because as the individuals have suggested who asked the question, maybe if Iran had made other policy decisions, that would have been $100 billion loss in size of the economy rather than 200. That's certainly possible. But generally speaking, I think the model gives us confidence that all other things being equal, it's the sanctions that are responsible for the economic underperformance. And frankly, there's little to suggest that in the immediate period after the imposition of sanctions, whether in 2012 or 2018, there was a dramatic difference in the quality of Iranian policymaking before or after the sanctions were imposed. I think, generally speaking, we would say, and maybe Nikolay can comment on this, that Iran has been more or less consistent in the quality of its economic policymaking. And it's certainly possible that over time, the sanctions will erode the institutions and the incentives to make good policy. And this goes to Professor Kamrav's question, which I can comment on maybe later. But in terms of the scope of our analysis in this sort of decade-long period, I think those factors are pretty much unchanged, and there's little reason to think that the difference is due to some big shift in how good Iran is at managing its economy.
Thank you so much, Esfandyar. Nikolay?
Thank you. Let me take where Esfandyar finished. I completely agree with that. Basically, if we have a look at the Iran's development strategies in 2012, 2015, and 2018, 22, at least until May 22, we could say that the Iranian leadership, relatively who was in charge of the presidential office, was quite consistent in implementing this resistant economy model. Not in the last turn because it was working and it was helping to deal exactly with this first wave of impact on the Iran's economy. From this point of view, this break between 2015 and 19 played quite a negative role in decision-making process because it was like a safe valve that was opened, and those negative effects that were leading to the second stage of impact, they were partly allayed, partly, how to say, taken away by the absence of a number of sanctions, limiting Iran's access to the oil market, to the financial market, and as a result, no one was thinking what to do when the corruption will be taking the very basic of production activities in Iran, the very basement of the Iranian economy. Right now, Iran is facing this issue. Iran is facing this challenge, and at least for now, I haven't seen any viable solution offered apart from this revision of the subsidies. As for the question by Mehran about the political privileges, I would really love to read this book, because that's exactly what echoes my vision of Iran's history after 1979. As an economist, I have a little bit narrow view, and I see this period of 40 years as the constant redistribution of the control over the economy between different political groupings inside the Iranian elite. So initially we saw the accumulation of wealth by the first generation of the revolutionaries. Then we saw under Ahmadinejad an attempt of redistribution by those who were fighting in the Iran-Iraq war and those who were restoring the country. That's how we saw the growing role of the RGC. And after 2012, if I may to assume, we saw this third generation coming into role of those who were enriching themselves by helping Iran evade sanctions. Because the sanctions evasion definitely created the whole layer of people in north of Tehran who can afford driving expensive BMWs, while the population of Iran is getting poorer and poorer, both in qualitatively and quantitatively. And the future of Iranian political system will be definitely an interplay between these three groupings on the one hand, and on the other hand, it will be determined by the ability of the political system to accommodate these groupings into the new realities when the sanctions will be lifted, or at least partially lifted, because definitely certain interests of the certain groups will be harmed.
Okay, we have still 10 more minutes. I could take a few questions. Okay, go ahead, Doctor.
Thank you. Thank you for invaluable presentation. I just want to bring the question of the Iran's application for the BRICS project, and which has been supported by China and Russia. If the sanctions are lifted partially or not lifted, how this application, if it's achieved, how this would bring some kind of support to this resistance economy in Iran? Thank you.
thank you for your presentations. My question goes to Nikolay Kozhanov. After the implementation of Ibrahim Raisi's course of this economic surgery, in reformist environment, an opinion surfaced that it was precisely to implement this relative liberalization of Iranian economy that it was necessary to provide the solidarity of all branches of power under the conservative control. In your opinion, to what extent should we render this opinion as a mere coping mechanism by the marginalized reformists, or can it in reality add to our understanding of the current political and economic dynamics in Iran? Thank you.
So, Nikolay, you're going to answer those one. I'll give you one question, and that is the concept of resistance economy. Is it? It seems to be very combative things, right? Given that the sanctions are lifted, if I'm advising the president, I might say, call it prosperity economy or something of that nature, or are we going to stay with the same slogan of resistance? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's where we're probably stepping in the area of interaction between ideology, our vision, and the economy. Of course, as I said, if sanctions are lifted, the story is not over. Iran will still be living in quite a challenging environment. But if we imagine that suddenly sanctions is the only challenge that we have, which is not true, then in this case, of course, the political elite will be challenged with the question whether to abandon the concept of resistance economy or try to modify this concept, or indeed to offer the idea of prosperity or concept of prosperity. And this will be quite a challenging choice, because the resistance economy gives an immense right to the government to control over the economy and to form exactly what was mentioned before, those groupings of support. Not to say that to a certain extent buying the loyalty of the low layers of population is on the one hand extremely challenging and extremely cheap under this system, because those people who are living under the poverty line, they don't need a lot of money to be spent on them, whereas the prosperity will implies greater market reforms, greater market freedoms, and also greater investments in the human capital, something that will definitely lead to the further transformation of the social system inside the country. Speaking about the reforms themselves, I guess it's an interesting situation. That's exactly from what I started my presentation. The reformists were always believed to be ready to do these reforms, but they never had guts to do this. Whereas the conservatives, they were compelled to do this. And they were basically taking the main risks on them. Ahmadinejad, with all controversy of this person, I can spend an hour explaining where he was making mistakes in his policies and how he killed the agricultural sector of the country, literally. But he take the silver bullet by launching this reform and open the doors for Rouhani to come and to blame for certain misfortune his predecessor. But unfortunately, Rouhani couldn't risk himself, he didn't dare to risk himself and to make the further steps. Though again, the sanctions, the restructuring of the subsidies was something that had been constantly discussed under his cabinet. So I guess they are just trying to earn an extra scores here. As for the BRICS and SCO, I guess this is the part of the strategy of preparation for the fact that sanctions is not going to handle all the issues. Iran would like to definitely deal with the Europeans, with the Westerners, but there is an understanding, at least in Raisi cabinet, that these people are not going to return immediately to the country. So Iran has to deal with Russia and China. Russia doesn't have money. We discussed, I guess, yesterday that Russians promised $40 billion of investments. I would really love to see from where they are going to get this $40 billion. That's one thing. But there is such a player as China, which can compensate the lack of financial resources. And that's why Iran is definitely interested in using currently Russian interest in playing with Iran, in involvement of Iran in a number of international projects, to be able to get an access to those non-Western players, including BRICS and including the Shanghai Cooperation SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Thank you, Esfandyar. Thank you, Nikolay. Esfandyar, you have 2 minutes, please, if you want to comment.
Sure. I agree with basically everything that Nikolay just said. The one thing I would add on the prospect of greater cooperation between Russia and China with Iran as an answer to sanctions is that, you know, Iran has been sort of discussing in that direction for a decade now, and even under Ahmadinejad, before the full imposition of Western sanctions, there was discussion that, you know, Iran should increase its sort of relationship with the East and with Russia. The reality is that Iran has gotten very little economically from its partnerships with those countries. I would point to the fact that in in March of 2021, Iran signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with China that was heralded as really the sort of marker that Iran was deepening its relationship with China, that China was ready to make big transformative investments in Iran. And in the subsequent 2 years, really the economic relationship between China and Iran has been stagnant. There has been really no recovery in bilateral trade and no investment has materialized. And that indicates that the presence of sanctions on Iran continue to deter most economic operators in China, in Russia, in other sort of non-aligned countries from working in the country. And so for Iran to take full advantage of membership in bodies like the SCO, the Eurasian Economic Union, or BRICS, there is this kind of consideration that sanctions relief, at least the lifting of secondary sanctions imposed by the United States, is necessary to really take advantage. And so in some ways, I would say that the JCPOA and its restoration is a necessary step, even if the Raisi administration is committed to, in the long term, minimizing Iran's dependence on the West for its economic development.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all of you for this very interesting session. And we are going to thank our colleagues, Nikolay and Esfandyar, for these greater presentations. And let us give them one more applause, and then we close the session. Thank you so much.